Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the closing plenary session focused on Zika. I'm Steve Morrison, Senior Vice President here at CSIS. I want to first begin with a congratulations to my colleagues who organized this fabulous day, Dan Rundy, Cantor Savoy, Christine Perkins, and the other members of the team, and congratulates them for such a successful day, and for also thank them for the opportunity to participate in this way. This is a terribly timely topic. It's one that affects us at home and abroad. It's one that has clear developmental dimensions and implications to it, and it's one that's very much in the news and in the forefront of the question of U.S. leadership in preparing ourselves for emerging outbreaks and responding accurately and effectively and competently. This is a period of a great test for us as a country at home and abroad, and it's a test of whether we've learned much from Ebola. Many of the people we're going to hear from today played a major role, including Amy Pope, Deputy Homeland Security Advisor, who's going to, in a moment, deliver the opening presentation that will kick this off. We know that we need to act early, and we need to act quickly. The White House needs to take a strong leadership role. The other major institutions within our government, CDC, USAID, and the abroad, NIH, and others need to be mobilized. We need to have adequate funding, good, strong plans, a bipartisan consensus on the way forward, and a long-term view around what it's going to take. These responses are complicated, they're long-term, they're full of risks, they're full of surprises. And of course we need technology, we need vaccines, we need diagnostics, we need therapies. Health security, which this falls under, health security has taken on a much higher prominence under the Obama administration with a lot of support from Congress. The Global Health Security Agenda we'll hear more about. The Ebola response we're familiar with, now the unfolding Zika response. Preparedness is inherently a very difficult mission. It's in response to episodic threats. Those episodic threats are oftentimes treated as individual events rather than as part of a stream of a new normal of recurrent outbreaks. We don't have regular dedicated funding streams to respond, and that puts stress on us. That puts stress on the executive, on Congress, to figure out a way forward. And as I said earlier, bipartisanship remains very fundamental to the effectiveness of U.S. leadership in response. And all of these cases are ones that put us into the midst of a considerable fog of uncertainty. Zika in particular, we've had no case up to now of a mosquito-borne pathogen that causes birth defects. If you go back to the early 60s, we have not had a new pathogen that causes birth defects. The last memory that any of us have would be the 64-65 rubella outbreak in the United States. So we're on new ground, we're on unfamiliar ground. There's a lot of puzzlement. There's a lot of scientific unanswered questions. There's a lot of people working terribly hard to answer those questions on an urgent crash basis, and we're making progress, but it's difficult. It's very difficult, and it's dangerous. And we have a hard time conveying in the midst of this fog what the real threats are, because we haven't seen, in the case of birth defects, we've not yet seen the full reality of an epidemic of infants born with brain damage. Such a tragic and terrible thing on our soil, in Puerto Rico, in the hemisphere. And that's the risk, that's the threat that we face, but in some ways, it's not all that real yet. And also we face a problem where our toolkit is somewhat, we are puzzling over how do you really bring protection to women in their childbearing years against this threat that is borne by mosquitoes? How do you do that? What are the tools that are going to truly provide protection? Are we going to ultimately migrate to delayed pregnancy? What are the options that are going to be most meaningful? And that's something that we're still struggling over, and I think we're going to be debating this for some time. I know there's a lot of activity on the Hill. Those of you who've watched what's happened last night, we know that we still lack a consensus. We have a polarized situation. Unfortunately, by contrast with some earlier places, in the midst of our electoral season, in the midst of our own domestic polarization, we're facing a very regrettable situation of delay, of considerable division over how much money, what kind of money, for how long do we need in the first cut in our response. So what we're doing today, we've asked Amy Pope, a close friend, a leader, someone who was at the center of the Ebola response, someone who's today at the center of the Zika response, as Deputy Homeland Security Advisor, as Special Assistant to the President of the United States on these matters. We've asked Amy to come and kick this off with a presentation that sets the stage on the U.S. outlook, the U.S. approach, the critical challenges, how this fits in the broader context of the expansive agenda the U.S. has launched under President Obama on health security writ large. After that, we're going to morph into a roundtable discussion where we will be joined by several other friends that I will introduce as we get seated. The point there is to bring in the other major players, the all-star team that works on these issues. We've got CDC represented, we've got PAHO, CDC, which has fully 1,000 of its troops deployed onto Zika, which rotated through over 1,400 experts into the Ebola response in West Africa. It's mobilized like in no other period in terms of a recurrent health security. Polio, Ebola, Zika. We have PAHO represented. PAHO, which took a leadership position quietly over a year ago in working on the Zika response, well before most of us actually realized what was going on down the street in PAHO. It was on this issue, and what it did was remarkably important in positioning us to be able to respond as we have in these last 6 months. We have the World Bank represented, and the bank has really transformed itself in the last few years in its operations on these issues. The pandemic emergency facility has been approved. It's going to be rolled out at the G7 summit in just a few days. Jim Kim will be here at CSIS on June 2nd, 11 to 12, 11 a.m. to noon, to present and discuss the outcomes of the G7, including that pandemic emergency facility. Please join us on that day if you can. We'll talk a little bit about the connection to basic development, which this forum here is the Development Forum. And I think it's pretty clear that you cannot have economic growth, you cannot have stability, you cannot have a predictable environment if you have societies, particularly those that are fragile or low-income societies, which are vulnerable and rocked by these emerging outbreaks that kick the pins out from underneath their economies and their budgets and their governing structures and force them into a 3 to 5 or longer year process of recovery. And developmentally, it's deeply regressive, and we've seen that certainly in West Africa. And I think as we look at what's happening in this hemisphere, as we look at the broader recovery from Ebola and the construction of capacities around the world, we need to remind ourselves that we're doing this to build stability, to build the opportunity for growth, for economic growth in these societies, and that this is fundamental. This isn't optional. So with that, please join me in welcoming Amy Pope.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here today with so many of you, really experts in your field who are thinking so deeply about the issues of the day. And it's really good to be back here at CSIS and with Stephen in particular, who's hosted a number of very important discussions and taken such leadership on issues involving global health, whether it's Zika or Ebola or what the next emerging infectious disease. Having this partnership is really important to me as someone who's serving in the administration, and it provides a really important forum for us to have these kinds of honest conversations. And I know the folks here have been involved in a range of very important conversations throughout the day relating to global development. And I'm hopeful that today's conversation can help us take a real world problem, a very urgent problem, and work through how the policies can apply. So I very much hope to learn from all of you here in the room, from my fellow panelists, because as you'll see from my remarks, we really believe this is a whole of community approach. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm the President's Deputy Homeland Security Advisor. I serve on the National Security Council staff. My role, quite simply, is to make sure that the federal government is as prepared as possible for whatever threat is coming to the United States. Now, that often means hurricanes or terrorists, and more often, it turns out to be infectious disease. And I have to be honest here, my exposure, and no pun intended, to infectious disease is fairly recent. My background is I'm a prosecutor. I do homeland security, border security issues, but I focus more on things like drug cartels, on terrorism, on breaching our borders. And it wasn't until I served on the Ebola response that I fully appreciated how we needed to prepare as a country for the threat of infectious disease. And how quickly, if we don't pay attention to the threats as they're developing overseas, that we'll be ill-prepared for when it comes to the United States. I also learned that we needed to take some of the lessons that we now use from things like terrorism, from drug trafficking, and the funding that we invest in those kinds of threats, and import those lessons, import the funding into how we approach infectious disease. We are never best positioned when we are simply reacting to something coming to the United States. We would never respond to something like ISIL in the homeland by simply reacting to what's happening on our soil. We would never respond to heroin trafficking in the United States by simply looking what's happening within the streets of Chicago. The way we make these investments is to invest in our partners around the world, to enable them to prevent, detect, and respond to these threats in partnership with us. That's how we prepare ourselves for threats, and that's how we need to prepare ourselves for something like Zika. And just think of the infectious diseases we've seen just during this administration. We've dealt with Zika. We've dealt with Middle East respiratory syndrome. We've dealt with the pandemic influenza, and of course, Ebola. These are not abstract threats to those of us at the National Security Council. The world is becoming ever more interconnected. Population growth, urbanization, global commerce, an unsurpassed level of intercontinental airline travel. These are creating the very conditions for a dangerous pathogen to emerge and quickly spread. And we just simply cannot rely on the old tools to respond to these threats. This is exactly why the President has taken so seriously the global health security agenda. That's why I, as a Deputy Homeland Security Advisor, spend so much of my time on the global health security agenda. And it's why Congress, in appropriating $1 billion in resources for the global health security agenda, took this threat so seriously, demonstrating that at least one point in time, they recognized the strategic significance of this issue to the United States. Frankly, as long as 70% of countries do not have in place the capacity they need to address biological threats, we here in the United States are at risk. As someone who has spent most of her career focused on border security, I can tell you with a great deal of confidence that there is no wall that we can build to keep out a mosquito. And as long as we cannot keep out a mosquito or any other vector, we cannot stop the spread of infectious disease. So let's talk about Zika specifically. We've been tracking the spread of Zika throughout the Americas now for some time. Once it was clear that the virus was spreading through Latin America, and more importantly, that the consequences of the spread of the virus were much more significant than we thought, we raised the alarm bells. And it was back in January. It was a very, very snowy day, if I remember. The federal government had closed, that the President called his national security and public health team in. And I promise you, we were more worried about frostbite than any mosquito bites. But nonetheless, when the President calls you in, you show up. He asked us to brief on what we knew about Zika, how it was spreading across the Americas, the threat to the United States and to Puerto Rico, and what we knew about the consequences associated with an infection. At that point, the World Health Organization and CDC hadn't yet made the link, the conclusive link, between Zika and birth defects, but it was clear there was a strong correlation. And the President made clear to us that we needed to step up our efforts, to work harder to develop a vaccine, to improve our diagnostic capacity, and to prepare the United States, even on that snowy day in January, for what we knew could come this summer. And here is what is so important to all of us who do this work for him. He made clear that this should not be a one-off effort. He made clear to us that what we're seeing with climate change, what we're seeing with outbreaks of disease around the world, that we needed to build systems that could be sustainable. We should not build just around one single threat. We needed to think long-term. And the efforts that we're making today need to be efforts that could be applied when the next threat emerges. And as a result of that conversation, the administration submitted a supplemental to Congress for $1.9 billion. That was back in February. And the point of that supplemental was to fund so many things that we had not prepared for, to fund diagnostics, vaccine development, preparedness and response activities around the United States, including in Puerto Rico. Because we know we're in a race against this mosquito. We're in a race against this virus. And I'll tell you what, this mosquito is wily. I'm sure you've all heard this now, but this mosquito likes to live in people's houses. It'll attach itself under the bed. It comes out during the day. You don't even feel it biting. And we know that just one bite from an infected mosquito can cause an infection in a person. And so the risks are quite significant, and the impact can be devastating. We've seen the devastating consequences already in places like Brazil, when the mothers discover that their babies have microcephaly or other very serious brain damage. These babies now face very uncertain futures. We're not even sure of the impact of the virus on the disease long term. This is not just sort of a standard disability. We're learning every day something new about how this virus is impacting the brain, and it's not good. Pregnant women all over the Western Hemisphere are now living in fear of a single mosquito bite. And here in the continental United States, mosquito season is here. We're already experiencing very serious outbreaks in the US territories. Puerto Rico is in the throes of the Zika outbreak, which could get worse as the season goes on. We are simply running out of time to get ahead of the virus. We urgently need more information, more data, more diagnostics, better vector control, and a vaccine to control the virus. Now, we, like you, are watching with a lot of interest what's happening up on Capitol Hill. And we're pleased that members are now taking action. But the amount of wrangling that continues to go on over how much to fund or when to fund it or whether to force other funding cuts, it's just dangerous, and it's wasting time that we need so preciously. The time to act is now. Our doctors, our scientists, our foremost experts, they've put together their best estimate of the amount of money we need to get ahead of this disease. This is not a partisan issue. This is not a game. And I promise you, this mosquito does not care whether you're a Republican or a Democrat when it's looking to bite someone. This is something that we need to work on together. In the meantime, we're not waiting to act. We have made very tough choices to move existing funding, some of our Ebola funding, some of our funding from other important pots of money, the state preparedness money, for example, to start this fight, but it's not enough. This isn't so that we are not caught flat-footed, but it is not enough to sustain a response. We're going to press ahead on our research efforts. We're creating partnerships around the world. President Obama has made agreements with Colombia, Brazil, Cuba, Canada to work together to advance our understanding of the disease and the consequences for human health. We're working very, very closely with our partners in the states to develop their preparedness plans, including setting reasonable expectations for the response and the roles that we each would play if there's an outbreak here in the continental United States. We have a team of people from CDC and from our other interagency partners who are now working in Puerto Rico. And we're refining our communication strategy so that we can communicate quickly and transparently when the public, stakeholders, state and local officials need to know about outbreaks that might be happening around the United States so that people can protect themselves. But we need your help. I started out by saying that it was so important that we're having this conversation because this is a whole of community problem that will need a whole of community response. We need the policymakers, the scientists, the public health experts, the communicators, the elected officials to join us in this fight, to aid with the research, to identify the best ways to reduce transmission, to find effective ways to communicate with the public, not to scare them, but to give them the tools and the information they need to best protect themselves and to protect their children. And for this group in particular, those of you who've been thinking about development issues for so long, those of you who are already committed to global health security, we need your help in keeping the world and Congress focused on our long-term goal, on building a safer future and our long-term health security by continuing to advocate for the global health security agenda, by reminding people that they should not have to choose between terrible diseases, by making clear that we are all so much safer the more we make long-term investments in our collective capacity to detect, prevent, and respond to emerging infectious diseases globally. I want to thank all of you for being here and for your efforts to protect the people of this world. Thank you so much.
I'd like to invite our other speakers up, please. Is it possible to move the podium back? Here, maybe I can just do this. We'll exit that way. Well, thank you very much, Amy. This next phase, what we're going to do is ask our guests to open with 6 to 8 minutes of remarks that focus on what they're up to, the major initiatives and outlook that they bring to this discussion. And as I mentioned, these are some of the main institutions that are here engaging. Our first speaker is Marcos Espinal, Director of the Department of Communicable Diseases and Health Analysis at the Pan American Health Organization, PAHO. Marcos, thank you so much for joining us. Marcos will be followed by Daniel Delitsky from the World Bank, Manager for Health, Nutrition, and Population for Latin America and the Caribbean region. And following Daniel will be Patrick Cutchor from CDC, who's the Medical Officer for the Malaria Branch in the Division of Parasitic Diseases and Malaria. So Marcos, why don't you kick things off for us?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here. I just try to limit to my 5 minutes that Steve kindly gave me. So, but just to start and following up what Amy was saying, just to start with what I would call a statement from an international organization. That money that is being discussed at Congress, Capitol Hill, is needed. It's highly needed because this epidemic is not over yet. We in the Americas, globally, is 46 countries as of today reporting transmission of Zika, of which 39 countries are in the Americas, countries and territories. Remember, the UK has territories, France has territories. So we're seeing countries that are, some of them subsiding the epidemic, but some others are not yet even seeing the peak. And we're seeing increases in the Caribbean, for instance. Remember, in the south, Brazil and Argentina, it was summer 2 months ago. They're now going into winter time. It has to deal with the Olympics later. So, but in the Caribbean, it's becoming the very heat and humid summer. So we don't know yet if the peak of this epidemic, it's going to be soon reached globally or regionally, let's say. So while some countries may be seeing a little bit of a decline, to say that the epidemic is over is, in our view, premature. Why? Because the people of the Americas were not exposed to this virus before. We might be seeing second wave of microcephaly next year in Brazil. We might be seeing third wave. You know, if you look at dengue fever, chikungunya fever, they're similar. They're cousins of Zika. We still have a huge epidemic of dengue fever in the Americas. So it's highly needed because remember, Zika as a disease might not be very difficult to handle. But when a child is born with microcephaly, that it's a marker for life for those families. And the key issue here is how we prepare health systems to ensure those children has proper care and attention. I just came from Brazil, touring 3 states. Pernambuco, which is the center of the thing, Paraíba, where CDC is having a major study. And you can see the efforts of the Brazilians, but you can also see in those families, and I spend time with women and mothers and children, it's really a sad situation. And those children will need a multidisciplinary team for life. So why is needed the money? Well, we need to make sure we continue doing vector control. We need to make sure we continue advising countries on how to do better surveillance, how to introduce new diagnostics. You just mentioned, we don't have the best diagnostic. It's not widely available, PCR in countries. It needs a lot of resources. We need to make sure we test new tools for vector control. There are some very promising new tools. It's a complicated matter that is not going to be, in the next few months, we can say, is over yet. What we think is going to happen in the future, probably, is that it will become endemic, like dengue fever, like chikungunya. But remember, the experience with dengue fever is for years we've been facing a major epidemic, and just recently a new vaccine came on board. So if we take the momentum to ensure that funding it's available for new vaccines, for new diagnostics, and new medicines, I think we're doing our job. If we think this is a simple issue, then we're not doing our job. PAHO is advising all the 39 countries. We have deployed 98 missions to the countries in the Americas. Missions composed by PAHO staff, but also experts from CDC, from WHO, and from other partners around the world. Training is a massive issue that is needed. It's not only money for new tools, but for capacity building. We need to train people on laboratory issues, on vector control, on surveillance. And finally, we need to make sure countries plan appropriately, because there is something called the International Health Regulations, which is a legal binding treaty that all member states of the World Health Organization sign up, for which the Global Health Security Agenda is a catalytic effort led by the United States and Finland. The core capacities of the International Health Regulations are the key issues to prepare countries not only for Zika, for Ebola, but also for the next one. Who knows? Tomorrow could be Lassa fever, cholera in Haiti. Emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases, to me, are the future, because we live in a globalized world, we live in a global village. So the work must not stop, and funding must flow, because I think the one to benefit are those poor families, those children that will be marked for life. I'll stop here.
Marcos, just while we have you here, one of the things that really struck me when Ebola happened, the annual travel flow back and forth between Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea, and the United States was on the order of 40 to 50,000 people. The annual flow from within this hemisphere back and forth to the United States is estimated at 40 million. That's a bit of a difference in terms of interactions of our populations. So I wanted you to say just a quick word about what that may mean in our interconnectedness in dealing with this. And secondly, we can't get away, as we talked about earlier, the Olympics is going to come up, so it's going to come up at some point, so maybe we could get you to just comment right now, because I know Margaret Chan spoke to that just a few days ago. It's a sensitive issue. It's one that is drawing more comment and opinion. So if you could just quickly tell us what the outlook is from within PAHO leadership on that, but also a bit about the degree of interaction that happens in this hemisphere, which is extraordinary.
Well, thank you. Regarding to your first question, it means all this traveling that we all are at risk. We are not immune to this. Germany today or yesterday reported sexual transmission of Zika. There are 10 countries reporting sexually transmitted Zika. There are 13 countries reporting Guillain-Barré syndrome increases. And there are 8 countries reporting increases in microcephaly cases now. So globalization, traveling, it's putting us there for us, you know. We have seen imported cases in the United States. And we know the mosquito is in several states in the United States. But the mosquito has there is a beautiful map circulating where the mosquito is all over the world.
Yeah.
It's all over the world. The Aedes it's a genius, I call it, because you know, it carries dengue, it carries Zika, it carries chikungunya. So to me, everyone is a risk. And we should not think we are immune. We need to take precautions. If we travel, we need to use repellents. We need to try to sleep under air condition. We need to use bed nets if possible. I went to Brazil, 3 states. I use precautions. That's the key issue here. The Olympics, I think it's a matter of precautions also. The position is PAHO and WHO and IOC are working together. Actually, last week there was a whole mission in Rio de Janeiro, IOC, PAHO, WHO, looking after the efforts the Brazilians doing in vector control. And believe me, they are doing very strong effort in trying to have the mosquito control by August, when the Olympic takes place. The new president has said he's fully committed to the Olympics. The evidence we have seen so far suggests that at this moment we cannot recommend postponing or canceling the Olympics for several reasons. First of all, the Olympics are in the winter time in Brazil. August, the mosquito is cold. The mosquito doesn't deal very well with low temperature. Mm-hmm. Historically, we have a strong evidence from dengue fever and that for the last 5 years, the peak of dengue fever in Brazil, it's in the first 3 months of the year, which is summer time. So also, athletes are going to be devoted to the Olympic Village, which is far away from a lot of breathing sites. They need to be committed, they need to go to bed early. Even if they go out, because they will go out, it's a matter of providing them with repellents, with education and precaution, but we don't think. And if you see Nature today and Lancet Infectious Diseases last week or this week, they also doing an analysis concluding that there is no need at this moment to recommend postponing or canceling the Olympics.
Thank you. Thank you. Daniel, we asked if you might offer some insights into what the economic consequences are here in terms of trade, travel, investment, health budgets, and other budgets. Tell us what, I know these are early days, but this is something the bank tracked very closely during the Ebola outbreak and made a major contribution in illuminating what the evolving consequences were. I'm sure this is something, as an economist, that absorbs a lot of your time and attention. So welcome and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Steve. It's great to be here. I apologize. I will be using a piece of paper. My memory is not what it used to be, and I want to make sure I quote. I'm bringing numbers, so I want to make sure I quote them correctly. But first, since time is very limited, I will start from the end, and then I will work backwards. The current estimates that we have on the economic impact of Zika in Latin America and the Caribbean is approximately $3.5 billion, or about 0.06% of GDP. So this is not a huge number when we think of the entire economy of the Latin American and the Caribbean countries. Obviously, different countries will be affected differently. The main avenue that we have analyzed to look at the economic impact has to do with tourism. And those countries whose economies are highly dependent on tourism will be affected the most. The margin we analyzed, the numbers we are presenting a range from 0.01% of GDP, which is almost negligible, to up to 1.2% of GDP, mostly in smaller Caribbean countries dependent on tourism. The second point I want to make, which is also coming from the end backwards, is that it's something that both Amy and Marcos emphasized in different ways, which is that there is so much we don't know about Zika, about the clinical and epidemiological aspects of Zika, that is extremely difficult to make a rigorous analysis of the economic impact, which means that we have to rely on lots of simplifying assumptions, and we have to specify a number of caveats associated with the numbers that I'm presenting today. And the natural consequence of that is that much more has to be done in order to understand the clinical and epidemiological aspects of Zika. And therefore, any investments that could be made to make this happen should be welcome. In terms of assumptions, usually when we looked at this, and we also looked at this in the case of Ebola, we look at three main transmission channels. The first one is direct costs: medical care, surveillance, diagnostics, vector control efforts, other public health initiatives, like communication campaigns, for example. And in this set of estimates, we have assumed that, those efforts are already ongoing, mostly because many of the Latin American and Caribbean countries have experience with vector control because of dengue and chikungunya, and therefore the efforts at this moment are somewhat marginal. It doesn't mean they are small, but they are marginal. The second is indirect costs driven by what we call aversion behavior, which is individuals who decide not to travel, for example, because of fear of contracting Zika. And this is the main transmission channel that we have looked at, and the main group affected by, we assume that the main group affected by Zika will be pregnant women or women of childbearing age, and that's in a way what drives the numbers. And the third channel is a second indirect cost, which is the productivity loss. So if somebody is sick, doesn't go to work, or if somebody tries to avoid being contracting Zika, maybe stays at home and doesn't go to work. This, in the case of Zika, this tends to be relatively small. We assume that it's relatively small because the clinical aspects of Zika are relatively minor. So the groups that are really affected are very small as a proportion of an economy. And the group who is affected is mildly affected. But obviously, this will depend on how many people contract Zika, and we don't know that number. Early on, PAHO had used an assumption of approximately 4 million people based on previous similar situations. I have seen analysis models that go up to 61 million people. Obviously, the economic cost will be different depending on how many people we think are going to contract Zika. If we use the 61 million figure, we estimate a net present value of lost productivity ranging from $625 million to approximately $1.8 billion for the entire Latin America and the Caribbean region. The final, I guess, estimate that we did economically has to do with microcephaly. And obviously, as Marcos said, this is it's a human tragedy. The families affected will be affected for life. But then again, when we look at it from the point of view of an economy, the numbers are still relatively small. So I want to put this in perspective. So what we did was we looked at, we assume a 61 million infections number for this wave of Zika in Latin America and the Caribbean. The model that we used estimates about 1.1 million Zika infections among childbearing women. And extrapolating numbers from Brazil, which are relatively high from what we are seeing now in terms of microcephaly, the range of microcephaly cases in Latin America and the Caribbean could go from 427 to about 3,200. And then, once we have that number, we estimate the cost of microcephaly in terms of the net present value of productivity lost for the families, for the children who are born with microcephaly, as well as some estimates of medical inflation costs that have been published elsewhere. And the number that we get is a range, a large range, between $94 million and $1.5 billion. So this is all I want to say in terms of economic impact, and I'm happy to elaborate.
Thank you. Is there a figure? You're saying 3,200 cases, projected cases of microcephalic infants with a carrying cost of upwards of 1.5 billion, if I understand what you've said correctly. Mm-hmm. How does that translate in terms of the lifespan of an individual child? What are you estimating? Because I think for everyone, that's a very powerful figure when you say prevention has to be our top line priority to avoid tragedy, but also to avoid the lifespan costs of these children who are going to be require enormous care for their entire lifetime. Yeah. So what do you have an operating figure?
I don't have the number with me, but this is, I mean, mainly two channels, right? So microcephaly will not be able to perform independently ever. So there will be no income generation ever. Will, I guess, impose a burden on their families in terms of child care, and they will impose a burden on the health system in terms of care. And I think, and besides that, obviously the specific medical care that these children will have to receive right. over their lifetime. So for an individual family, this is a large number.
Right. I mean, I've heard, I think Tom Frieden used quite a large range of 1 million to 10 million per child over the lifespan, which is a somewhat staggering figure. Yeah. Let me ask you another sensitive question, which is what are your projections in terms of women choosing to abort or terminate pregnancies when they learn? I know there's complications of when do they learn, but do you have an operating assumption around that in projections?
That's almost impossible to figure out, given the differences in legislation in different countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. I don't know, Marcos, you may have some.
I mean, when you look at what happened in the U.S. in the rubella outbreak in the mid-'60s, there were 20,000 cases, as I recall, of birth defects, but there were also quite a number of miscarriages, and I don't know what the termination rates were, but there were another 20 to 30,000 cases, and you know that's a long time ago. Anyway, thank you, Daniel. Sure. Patrick, tell us about CDC. Tell us about the particular issues that you're struggling with.
Sure. At CDC, we're happy to be part of what we view as a whole of government approach that's necessary to confronting this emergency. Amy used the term whole of community approach, which I think is even more appropriate in this setting, because it's not just the government and public sector entities that are vital here. It's partners across a wide range of sectors. And I think that's very important when I speak on behalf of CDC, that I do so with the full awareness that we're part of a partnership that's necessary to make a difference. I want to extend regrets on behalf of Dr. Frieden, who's not able to be here in person today. And then maybe in talking about some of the science and surveillance issues we're grappling with, I'd like to break the perspective down into 3 levels at which we operate at CDC. One is the unilateral level, or walk across the domestic issues related to this response. So far, ongoing mosquito-borne transmission has been confirmed in more than 47 countries and territories this year and last year. Those include Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and American Samoa. So in this situation, we are very much an affected country in a way that even with Ebola, we didn't experience. Our work domestically involves helping state and local health officials prepare for the oncoming mosquito season, helping them develop the surveillance systems, and providing them with diagnostic reagents so that they can confirm the diagnosis of Zika virus in patients suspected. With Zika virus, Dr. Espinal mentioned we really don't have a good test. And we don't, so far, have a lot of private sector partners who are ready to scale up the technology to make diagnostic tests. And so for now, CDC's laboratories are working around the clock to produce diagnostic reagents. We make these available through an agreement with the Food and Drug Administration. We make these available for reference diagnosis at public health laboratories across the US. And that's the basis for being able to confirm the diagnosis here in the US. We've also got an important bilateral role, and that's working one-on-one with partner countries, US to Brazil, US to Colombia, US to Panama, have been very important opportunities for us to provide technical advice on how to confirm diagnosis, how to track the impact. And they've been very important opportunities for our scientists to work with Brazilian, Panamanian, Colombian scientists and research institutions to answer some of the outstanding questions we don't yet know. Through some of these bilateral efforts, we've been able to learn enough about the association between microcephaly and Zika virus infection that in late April, we were able to conclude that Zika virus is a cause of microcephaly. Making that causal determination is important because it allows us to start thinking and planning in a more deliberate way. It also is a clearer message to communicate to people about the risks. But we do know that it's not the cause of every case of microcephaly, and we know that every woman infected won't necessarily have a child who's afflicted with microcephaly or another birth defect. We also don't know, I think we have a pretty clear idea that microcephaly is an outcome. We don't yet know how frequently it's an outcome. We don't know what the determinants are, whether the timing during pregnancy has to be just right, whether there are other cofactors that are important in determining it. And maybe more importantly, microcephaly is a pretty devastating but obvious birth defect. There's likely to be a range of conditions that affect children born to women who are infected. And learning what that is will be important to know what kinds of resources to make available to plan for serving the needs of these children and their families going forward. We're able to provide, through bilateral arrangements, we're able to provide diagnostic reagents for up to 75 countries now, and requests keep coming in, and that number is ever expanding. We're also engaged through some of the reprogramming of existing resources that Amy spoke about. We're engaged with the U.S. Agency for International Development in working to program resources to help confront the Zika virus situation in affected countries in Latin America. And we just have done some preliminary planning with resources recently mobilized to that effect. And then finally, after the unilateral or domestic and the bilateral country-to-country support, we have an important multilateral role, both in terms of the U.S. Technical and political leadership that can be very transformative in confronting the Zika situation, but also providing technical experts to contribute to policy discussions at PAHO and the World Health Organization central level, listening to what others are saying in those fora and taking them forward. Being able to take the experiences we're having in Puerto Rico, where we're able to try firsthand some of the new tools or some of the old tools, and share with people what some of our particular challenges and hopefully soon some successes might be that could help set global policy or help other partners decide how to best use their resources to contain the extent of the epidemic. And I think across these three realms, I think the other lens to look at the Zika response through is the global health security lens. And Amy concluded by invoking the spirit of global health security and the theme to prevent, detect, and respond to emerging disease threats. I'd like to acknowledge Admiral Jordan Taparro, who's here in the audience with us today. Admiral Taparro is the director of CDC's Division of Global Health Protection, and among other things, that houses our assets in support of GHSA. I wonder if I could indulge you, Steve, to ask Jordan to make a few comments on that.
Well, we'll need to get a microphone to you. And Jordan, if you could just say a few words. Do we have a microphone? Just up front here. Be very brief, please.
Thank you very much. Just a few words then. I think Marcos touched on the international health regulations and the binding treaty. That was pulled together, those revised international health regulations in 2005 because of our global experience with SARS, which over a 4-month period reached 37 countries. After that, there was a clock that started in 2007 that said that all countries under this binding treaty would reach compliance with the international health regulations, so that would be all globally better prepared to detect and respond to the next infectious disease threat. And Amy mentioned that 70% of countries are not prepared. She was invoking that 70% of countries haven't yet reached the international health regulations. And that's why the Global Health Security Agenda was launched. It was launched because of our experience with the H1N1 pandemic, where many countries were not prepared to detect as that pandemic marched its way around the globe, but because we had other examples, which she also invoked, like Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus. And so that is such an important target that all countries reach international health regulation compliance so that we're better prepared. And that's why the Global Health Security Agenda was launched in February of 2014. Meanwhile, Ebola was smoldering along undetected in West Africa when it was launched. Sadly, several months later, when we were seeing exponential threat of Ebola throughout West Africa, we finally had the attention of the global community, and we were fortunate that President Obama's request for emergency funding to address that threat and address global health security agenda goals received funding. Over the past 2 years, the United States and 22 other countries that originally joined the agenda have now been joined by over 40 others. There are 60 countries that are committed to the global health security agenda. The G7, the US government, many other countries are working to provide the resources, and there are tools that have been developed that set a baseline in countries that are independently assessed and made available for the global community to work with countries so that each country can be better prepared. The United States, for its part, is committed to working in 31 countries, and 17 of those 31 countries, we are well on the way with the USG, USAID, CDC, other parts of departments and agencies across the US government to help those countries reach real clear targets so that they can be successful to reach IHR compliance in the years ahead. Now we're faced with a new threat, a predictable threat, like Zika. Then there will be more. We really need to stay focused in the countries where we're working to show success so that the other countries that have joined the agenda and put resources toward this effort also stay in the fight. It's going to be a long fight to get all 70% of those countries that haven't yet reached IHR compliance to be compliant. And the global community is only as prepared as the weakest link in that chain. Lastly,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, lastly, we have threats like Zika and Ebola where they're acute and they're demonstrable. But there are others, and looking back, like HIV, the sentinel event in my experience in training as a young doctor, where for 10 years something like HIV smoldered along as Slim's disease and went undetected. Just imagine if the next event is something like that. We really need to do this work and stay committed to the cause. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan. So we have a few more minutes. I want to share a few big impressions that came across from the remarks from Amy's opening speech and what we've heard from our other speakers. Clearly there's quite a blurred line in this case of Zika between domestic and international. And we've got to be moving ahead on both fronts. And I think probably as we feel this domestically, it's going to aid us in our international response because it's not going to be so alien and unrecognized. And this is a special kind of situation in that regard. As we've heard from Jordan, as we've heard from Amy, as we've heard from others here, there is a strong link to the response to Zika and all of the good work that's been done in the global health security agenda in mapping that out. There's a fit, even if the countries don't overlap. We're talking about the same problem set, and we're talking about the same tools and investing in capacity building over the long term. We're going to have to continue to live for the next 4 years or so, maybe longer, with the absence of a vaccine, which leaves us with a really tough situation. What are we really going to offer the women that are in their childbearing years or pregnant that are going to be truly effective? I think we're still, at the center of the picture is this question that we haven't really yet answered for ourselves. Daniel's estimates around the costs seem, and developmentally, these costs seem pretty manageable, but I think for the families impacted, they will be devastating. For some small countries, they will be very, very devastating. This is going to have very uneven impacts. And asymmetrical ones. And you might make the same argument. Wealthy people in the United States are going to be living in air-conditioned homes. They're going to have screens. They're going to be remote from this. This could potentially, in our coastal areas, and particularly in densely populated, poor coastal areas, this could be a problem of poverty. It could be a problem of folks of color. It could be more disempowered and marginal populations that suffer the most here. I also have this very strong impression that all of you are working really hard, scrambling to try and find the change that's fallen behind the cushions in in the couch because we all know that things have to happen now.
Right.
And while you're working really hard to kind of get the consensus of moving forward with adequate resources to sort of do that, you can't just wait. And so thank you all for what you've done. Maybe you could, Amy, you could begin by giving us some idea. What are we? We're 90 days beyond the request, roughly, I believe. Maybe it's roughly about 90 days after the request. We're looking at not being able to conclude this because of legislative process, perhaps for another 60 days. So we've got a built-in delay. We have to scramble, we have to move the parts around, we have to move the furniture around and hope we can sort of patch together an interim response, and maybe we'll catch up later, maybe we won't. Maybe we'll have to postpone some other things that are very worthy while we move this ahead. But my question is really, what's the gap? When we look back in July, August, September, how much will we not have been able to do because of this delay? Do you have any sense of an ability to quantify or illuminate? What is it? Because we're in the midst of this process where we're not fully fueled up to do what we need to do.
So it's playing out in a couple of ways. One of the couches we moved around, or one of the places where we found change, was in the public health emergency preparedness grants. And that is money that we would normally give to states to manage whatever emerging public health issue that they are seeing. And basically that grant money hadn't yet been distributed, so it was available for us to pull into our Zika response. We hear quite a bit from public health communities around the United States that is a real loss for them, that in some cases this means that they have fewer staff, public health staff, whose salaries they can pay. It means that there were other health priorities that were emerging in their particular district that they can't now lead on. And it's a very concrete, real exchange that they're being forced to make. That's not the way that we should be doing business. So I think that's one way to one way to contextualize what's happening right now. And then secondly, when you look at how we would use this money and what impact it will have, when we're talking about vaccine development, when we're talking about diagnostics, we're not talking about a one-year process. To get the manufacturers to come to the table to make the investments in research and development, they need to know that we are committed to the outcomes. They need to know that this is a long-term investment that the United States is making. And when we can't show them that we have the resources available for that kind of long-term investment, that means that they're reluctant to come to the table to do the kind of research and work that we need on vaccines, for example, or diagnostics. And that is a very tangible will have a very tangible impact on this disease, because ultimately, as you pointed out, Stephen, there are not lots of great ways to protect pregnant women when the mosquito is endemic in their community. And the best thing we can do is develop vaccines that people can take to protect themselves. And so that's the trade-off that we're making.
Marcos, from PAHO's standpoint, what's the gap here? You're not entirely dependent upon what the U.S. investment strategy is, but you're consulting with governments that are scrambling to figure out how they can bring greater resources to the table.
Well, I think this is a long battle, because in Latin America we have countries that are middle-income countries, but we also have countries that are very low-income countries. Haiti, the case, yeah. Honduras, countries with a lot of problems, and governments are putting money out of their own budget, but it's not sufficient. When I mention 98 missions to countries, each mission costs me between $10,000 and $20,000. So because I cannot send 5 people to Brazil, it's a huge country. Yeah. We need to send at least 15 or something like that. I need expertise. So it's a long way, in my view, because if these become endemic, that's when the vaccines, the new diagnostics will be important, because we know it's going to take time for the vaccine, but it's likely this is going to become endemic. It's not going to say that next year we're going to have 0 cases of Zika. No, because that's the behavior. So I think it's a long way. I don't think it's something that we should be. There's a huge capacity building efforts, and to me, that's the main gap that it's at the countries that we are supporting. We need to continue, and as you rightly said at the beginning, not many travelers to Africa, but many in Latin America and the Caribbean, and human resources are available in Latin America and the Caribbean, and infrastructure is available. But state-of-the-art training, it always has to be refreshing on vector control, on new tools, on new issues. So it is a long battle that is not going to be ending tomorrow, in my view.
Daniel, do you think that the bank is going to jump in a bigger way in terms of active in the facilities available to assist countries in making these sorts of longer-term infrastructure investments? This is something that Jim Kim talks a lot about, both on the insurance side of the quick response, but also talking about the longer-term capacities.
Maybe one or 2 points on this. The first is that in Latin America and the Caribbean, we are not the only player in terms of multilateral organizations who provide financing. There is the Inter-American Development Bank, and we are actually working very well together and coordinating the response. Second point is that the World Bank has made available a relatively large amount of money, $150 million for Zika response. But at the same time, picking up on something that Marco said, countries have many priorities, right? And so it's difficult to tell government, well, maybe you shouldn't do this investment in education, instead you should prepare for Zika. Many countries are thinking in those terms. It's a zero sum. And so the uptake of this money that is available for Zika has been relatively slow. Also something that you said, Marcos, is that this is a medium-term effort, and I think it's going to take some time for countries to realize the potential risks and the potentially large economic impact of this.
Thank you. Why don't we gather several, we'll bundle together several questions and comments. We have folks with microphones. There's 2 people here, one over here. Anyone else? Back here? Yes, sir. Please identify yourself and one intervention, please.
Gary Merritt. Thanks to all of you for a very information-packed series of presentations. The most striking thing to me is that if I heard correctly, only Amy mentioned in a glancing way 2 or 3 times vector control. And it's something that each of you, I think, should have much more to say about, or I was struck at least by the absence of talk about vector control. Now, we know in the US it's a local, county-based issue, but therefore there's an impact from the shift of funding in that regard, I presume. But why not more talk about mosquito control?
Thank you. Right here.
Yeah, thanks. My name's Michael O'Brien from Relief International. So stepping back to science a bit. So from combating HIV and Ebola, we found that stigma against survivors has led to social rejection, diminished quality of life, and instances of the cases of the actually going underground. How can we use these lessons learned to best serve survivors and not hinder our efforts to detect and prevent new Zika infections?
Didn't get that question. Right here. And then back. Yes, ma'am.
Linda Arthur from ADB. This morning's panel was about the value of leveraging, and particularly leveraging private sector support, crowding in private sector financing. Now it's much more obvious in, say, the infrastructure sector or the energy sector. I wanted to ask anyone on the panel really if you see any real opportunities here for crowding in private sector support in the fight against infectious disease.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve Luckett. I work and study here in the city. Thanks much for the panel. What's been the interaction between the the NSC and the CDC with the IOC? Is my first question. And to you specifically, Ms. Pope, has there been any discussion among your bosses, Ms. Monaco, Ambassador Rice, about the U.S. boycotting the Olympics? And thank you.
Do you have any others up front here? And then we have one more.
Charles Newstead, State Department. What are the possibilities of accelerating the production of a vaccine? Is that something that could be done with more money? And also, what incentive do we have to give the farmers to do that? Do we just have to have a market for it afterwards, which is assured? What sort of pressure can we put on the farmers to do it?
Thank you. One more, and then we're going to come back. I'm sorry. But yes, please.
Just a specific question off of two previous questions. What companies have you all worked with to develop a therapeutic or a treatment? There's been a lot of talk about vaccines, diagnostics, and vector control, but have you all worked with any private partners on developing a treatment?
Thank you. I just want to add, we'll have another round. We'll come back. We've got 10 minutes. We're being permitted 10 more minutes, as I understand. We did attempt to enlist Tony Fauci for today, but was unable to come. So we're on that side of things. We're not represented on this panel, but some of our panelists are certainly conversant with those issues. Amy, do you want to take a few of those?
Yeah, there's so many great questions there. I'll package maybe and hit a couple of them. On vector control, it's primarily just the nature of this particular conversation that I haven't spent more time talking about it. It's very much in our minds. I will tell you that it's quite challenging here. This is not a mosquito that responds well to some of the vector control measures we've used against the malaria mosquito, for example. And so we are kind of throwing everything against the wall, trying to figure out what will work here, and we are still learning. But that is very much part of our problem solving. And that kind of goes into the next question about what's the role of the private sector here. We learned from Ebola that the private sector plays extraordinarily important role, whether it involves research or the innovative thinking or just the ability to cut through bureaucracy and come up with solutions. And so we're actually hopeful that we'll have some big private sector action within the coming weeks that we'll be able to announce. I myself have been able to join in some really exciting efforts. We call them hackathons, where you kind of throw together a bunch of really smart people from different parts, from the private sector, from academia, from the public health community, and they come up with a range of solutions. We now have some money through the USAID to fund some of those innovative ideas. So this goes back to a whole of community. There is a lot of, we in the federal government don't have all the answers and need to bring in a range of players on vector control, on community outreach, on vaccine development. On therapeutics, just a quick point is that we actually don't know that there are therapeutics that make a big difference here, right? If you are not pregnant, the impact of Zika is relatively mild in most cases. And so, and once you are infected and you are pregnant, there's not much that we can do except for, provide support if the baby's born with microcephaly or other birth defects. So to hit all of that, I mean, there's a lot of good work there, and we need the smart folks in this room to help us come up with solutions.
Can you say anything about the question on the diplomacy with the IOC?
We've been working closely with a range of stakeholders here. I think our best information is, as Marcos said, is that the number of mosquitoes is actually quite minimal at this time of year. We are constantly evaluating that. The CDC is in close contact with the government of Brazil. They're looking at the vector control measures they've put into place. We will continue to stay in close touch with our athletes and with the government of Brazil to make sure that people are not taking unnecessary risks. But bottom line, this is a decision that athletes will need to make for themselves. The primary risk, as we know, is to pregnant women and to their partners. And so if the athlete or family member falls into one of those categories, we would say you need to have conversations with your doctor about what is the right approach here.
Thank you. Marcos?
Yes, a couple of comments. On vector control, the number one recommendation of PAHO to all the countries is to boost vector control. And PAHO has put together a group of experts, actually the White House attended that meeting, to issue recommendations on vector control to the countries. The issue is that vector control is not very easy to do because it requires multi-sectorial interventions. So at the same time, WHO has issued a statement recommending 3 potential new tools that could be good in the long term. They have shown entomological impact, and now they are trying to show epidemiological impact for full recommendation. One is the Wolbachia-infected mosquitoes, the other one is the genetically modified mosquitoes, and others sterilized mosquitoes. So these studies are ongoing in Brazil and Colombia. So, but that's the #1 recommendation. People have to be educated how to close. It's a different mosquito to what malaria is about. So, but it is not an easy task. But that's one of the main messages in terms of risk communication and advocacy that we pass in education. Has to be involved several ministries. I think that's pretty much on vector control.
Patrick, do you want to jump in?
Sure. On the vector control side, too, we're working with state and local authorities on what can be done. It kind of ties into your question, Steve, about what might not happen without the right resources, because without the right resources, a lot of money could be spent on vector control that's not well coordinated, that doesn't do much good, and that we, in the end, haven't invested enough into learning from the experience, so that we're left next mosquito season not knowing any more than we do now, that we have a handful of tools. Some of them are expensive, some of them are promising, but we haven't exploited the opportunity we had to learn how to use them effectively. That's what I worry we could be missing out on.
Dan?
No, the only thing I would add on vector control is that, as I said, many of the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean have good experience implementing vector control. I just remember Brazil, for example, in the initial stages, even deployed the military to make sure that every single house in the affected areas was being visited and making sure that the breeding grounds were being removed. So that's it.
Just to add on the Olympics, in the World Cup, it was in Brazil last year. Only few cases of dengue fever.
Okay. Let's do just a couple of final questions, comments, and then we'll swing back. There's a hand up in the back there, and there's a hand up right here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Ashley Thomason from Apt Associates. I just wanted to ask the panel about the intersection of reproductive rights and the impact of Zika on women, and particularly the disproportionate burden on women to prevent the transmission of Zika. And I feel like, as a prior commenter mentioned, there was maybe not so much discussion on vector control. I also believe that this is a glaring omission from the discussion on the response to the Zika outbreak.
Thank you. Right here.
Hi, my name is Mindy Reiser. I'm vice president of an NGO that deals in peace building and conflict resolution. Question about working with scientists from China and India. The numbers there are huge and the implications are equally huge. And what kind of work is being done with those scientists who work with mosquitoes, and what kind of creativity can they bring to these questions?
Okay. Over here. And then we're going to close.
Thank you. I'm ambassador of Cabo Verde, Cape Verde Islands, the only country in Africa touched by Zika so far. Then, since Zika is a global threat, as has been said, no wall to stop it, a country like mine is looking for a global response, be it strategic, about prevention, vector control, about care, about inclusive of countries and communities. Then my appeal is how far the global response is inclusive of countries and communities. So far, every time we listen about Zika, I'm sorry, and for the respect for all those countries, we listen only about Latin American and South American countries, Caribbean, not Africa. I thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We've got just a few minutes left. I'm going to start with Amy, and we just move our way down, and we'll close up. Amy?
So there is a lot that we need to be learning from each other and from countries around the world. In fact, most of what we learned was from the early outbreaks of Zika. But what we are seeing now is that Zika, the virus is evolving, and the consequences that are now associated with Zika are evolving in a way that we didn't anticipate. So I think what CDC is doing so well, and what some of the money that we've reprogrammed is meant to do, is enhance our research with other partners that are experiencing the virus so that we inform our collective understanding. On the question of reproductive rights, I don't want to get, that's a big, big question, but what I will say is that because the disease impacts women and their partners in such unique ways, this is a place where we believe that women need to make sure their voices are being heard, right? We need to make sure that whether it's in Congress, whether it's in communities, we need to have the education, we need to make sure this is part of our conversation. And so I've been doing outreach on things like scary mommy blogs and what to expect when you're expecting, and all sorts of ways in which we're reaching communities that may not otherwise be politically active. But this is a place where we need to make sure that the communities are impacted have a strong voice.
A couple of comments just to say the global response. I can give you more details. There are 6 incident managers, 1 for each WHO region, and there is 1 for Africa. We're working in Africa with Cape Verde and other countries. In fact, the Institut Pasteur in Senegal is doing a lot of research on the Zika issue. And there is also an incident manager for Zika in Asia. We work for the Americas, this region, for PAHO, but there is, I can give you details. And in fact, there is a global situation report every week, and I can give you the link for you to access. Regarding reproductive rights, let us remember that many countries in Latin America do not allow abortion, not even therapeutic abortion. There's a lot of religious issues in Latin America. It's a strong discussion that was even taken to the Supreme Court of Brazil by activists. What we are saying as PAHO is every woman needs to have the facts. What are the risks? What are their options? And they need to have access to contraceptive services and to information. Because at the end of the day, the decision to be pregnant is the decision of the woman and her partner, so or not. But when a country recommends, let's not be pregnant for 2 years, be careful with that, because we might be killing the birth rate of a country. But when a country like Colombia says, for instance, we recommend women to consider postponing pregnancy for the peak of the epidemic, which is 3 months, I said, well, that might be a sound recommendation to consider. But it is a very sensitive ethical issue that has to deal with a lot of legislation in Latin America and the Caribbean.
Thank you, Dan.
I echo what was said. I don't have anything else to
Okay.
add.
Patrick, do you have any
Sure.
last word on the
Well,
reproductive rights?
I think on the reproductive rights, I think a lot of great points have been made. As you know, we don't know exactly what's effective against this mosquito. We do know how to prevent pregnancy. And women who want access to family planning, this is an opportunity to make sure we expand that right and that access. In terms of mosquito science, that was the other question that appealed to me in particular. Some of the new technologies that Marcos mentioned have come from the minds of mosquito scientists. Looking at how to engage them is an important part of our work at CDC. It's also a part of the Grand Challenge opportunity that USAID has put out. And we'll be looking for other good ideas about mosquito control. This is a very challenging mosquito to deal with. It's adapted particularly well to living where we live and among us, and the big engineering interventions really don't have an impact on it the way they do on some nuisance mosquitoes and some other mosquitoes. So combating it is really challenging.
Thank you. Again, I want to congratulate the organizers for this day. Dan Rundy, Connor Savoy, Christina Perkins and their team, and Chevron for its support, acknowledge Chevron for its generous support of CSIS to undertake this work on development. From our staff, a number of people worked really hard: Joe Jordan, Anya McDermott, Catherine Streifel, and others. Travis Hopkins, again, thanks Travis for keeping us all wired up here this afternoon. Amy, Marcos, Daniel, Patrick, we're very grateful, and Jordan, for you all being with us today and taking this time to share with us quite openly, I think, the complexity of this and the urgency and the importance of us really understanding what's at stake, understanding what needs to happen. I think that I'm delighted that we did get the reproductive rights issue out at the conclusion here, because I'm not sure whether Zika is going to divide us or unite us on that issue, whether we're going to find ourselves back into old culture wars being fought out over this, or whether it's going to have a liberating effect in bringing sensible people to the center around what the solutions are going to look like. I think this is another one of those uncertainties which could be treacherous or could be just quite a wonderful thing, and it's just not clear. And the leadership in how we shape the discourse and how we position these issues in the next 6 to 12 months is going to be terribly important in that particular outcome, along with the bigger outcome. So please join me in thanking all of our speakers here today.